You know what's funny about life? One day you're living what you think is your best life, and then boom, one phone call changes everything. But I'm getting ahead of myself here. Let me back up and tell you how this whole mess started, because trust me, it's way more complicated than anyone realizes. My name's Crystal, I'm 34, and up until recently, I thought I had everything figured out. Landon and I had been married for 8 years. 8 years of what looked like the perfect relationship from the outside. We had this decent apartment, steady jobs, and we were even talking about starting a family. Everything seemed so stable, so secure. I work in software sales, specifically selling accounting programs to banks around the city. It's actually pretty decent money when you're good at it, and I am damn good at it. I've got this natural ability to connect with clients that just works. I can walk into any stuffy corporate office and have those uptight managers interested within minutes. Landon always said he was proud of my success. But looking back, I think there was always this underlying tension about how much I traveled for work. Here's the thing about Landon that nobody really understood. He wasn't your typical pushover husband. He was actually pretty intense about certain things, especially when it came to control. He had this way of making everything seem like a discussion, when really he'd already made up his mind about how things should go. Like our evening routines, our weekend plans, even how we spent money. He had opinions about everything, and this subtle way of making you feel guilty if you didn't go along with his vision. The thing about sales is that it's all about relationships. You can have the best product in the world, but if you can't connect with people, you're not going to close deals. And I was always really good at connecting with people, especially men. Not in a sleazy way, I just understood how to make them feel important, how to laugh at their jokes, how to make them think they were the smartest person in the room. It was just business. At least that's what I told myself at first. But after 8 years with Landon, I started feeling suffocated. He had this way of questioning everything I did. Not directly, but with these little comments and looks. If I came home late from a client meeting, he'd make some passive-aggressive comment about dinner getting cold. If I mentioned grabbing drinks with colleagues, he'd get this tight expression and ask a million questions about who was there and what we talked about. It was exhausting, always having to justify myself to someone who supposedly trusted me. That's when Shane entered the picture. He was the VP of operations at one of the biggest banks in the city, and landing his account would have been huge for my career. When I first walked into his office for our initial meeting, I could tell he was different from my usual clients. He was probably late 30s, with this confidence that wasn't arrogant, but definitely commanding. He actually listened when I talked, asked intelligent questions, challenged my proposals in ways that made me think harder. Our first few meetings were completely professional, I swear. But there was this energy between us, this chemistry that I hadn't felt in years. He'd make these little comments about my presentations being impressive, or he'd remember details from our previous conversations that even Landon wouldn't remember. It felt incredible to be seen, really seen, by someone who appreciated my intelligence and my drive. The meetings started running longer. What should have been hour-long presentations turned into 2-hour discussions about business strategy, market trends, even personal philosophies about success. He'd walk me to my car afterward, and we'd stand there talking for another 20 minutes. I started looking forward to these meetings in a way that probably should have been a red flag, but I convinced myself it was just professional excitement about landing such a big client. Shane was everything Landon wasn't: spontaneous, ambitious, intellectually challenging. He'd suggest we continue our discussions over lunch at these amazing restaurants I'd never been to. He'd send me articles he thought I'd find interesting, with little notes about how they reminded him of points I'd made. It felt like he was actually paying attention to who I was as a person, not just monitoring my every move like Landon did. I started putting more effort into my appearance on days when I had meetings with him. Better outfits, more time on my makeup, making sure my hair looked perfect. I told myself it was just professional. You want to look your best for important clients, right? But deep down, I knew I was dressing for him, trying to impress him, hoping he'd notice. The worst part is that Landon didn't notice any of this. Well, that's not entirely true. He noticed I was coming home later, but instead of asking if I was okay or if something was bothering me, he'd make these snide comments about me living at the office or caring more about work than our marriage. It was like he could sense something was different, but chose to be resentful about it instead of actually trying to connect with me. Looking back now, I can see all the moments where things shifted from professional to personal with Shane. It started with little things. Him complimenting my earrings. Me mentioning how Landon never noticed when I got my hair done. Shane would listen to me vent about my marriage with this understanding look, never judging, just letting me talk. He made me feel heard in a way I hadn't felt in years. The first time we kissed was after a particularly long lunch meeting. We'd been discussing the final details of his software package, and he walked me to my car like always. But this time, instead of our usual 20-minute conversation, he just looked at me and said, "Crystal, I need to be honest about something." And then he kissed me, right there in the parking garage, and it was like every nerve in my body came alive at once. I should have stopped it right there. I should have told him it was a mistake, that I was married, that we needed to keep things professional. But instead, I kissed him back. Because for the first time in years, I felt wanted, desired, appreciated for who I was, instead of criticized for who I wasn't. That's when things got complicated. Shane suggested we meet at his office more frequently to finalize the details of his account. These weren't real business meetings anymore, and we both knew it. The first time we were alone in his office, I took off my wedding ring and put it in my purse. I told myself it was because it felt weird to be intimate with someone while wearing another man's ring. But really, I think I wanted to pretend, even for an hour, that I wasn't tied down to anyone. His secretary, this uptight woman named Arya, started giving me these weird looks whenever I came in. I could tell she suspected something, but I didn't care. For the first time in years, I felt alive, desired, like I was more than just someone's wife going through the motions of a marriage. Shane and I started meeting 3 or 4 times a week. Sometimes we'd go to lunch at these out-of-the-way places where we wouldn't run into anyone we knew. Other times we'd stay in his office after hours when most of his staff had gone home. He made me feel beautiful, intelligent, sexy. All the things Landon used to make me feel but had stopped bothering with years ago. The thing is, I never meant for it to become a full-blown affair. It just sort of happened gradually, one meeting at a time, one kiss at a time, one lie to Landon at a time. Before I knew it, I was living this double life. Dutiful wife at home, passionate lover at Shane's office. And for a while, it was intoxicating. I started making up excuses for why I was coming home late. The client needed extra time to review the proposal. Traffic was terrible. I had to stop by the office to finish some paperwork. Landon would give me these suspicious looks, but he never directly confronted me about it. Instead, he'd make these passive-aggressive comments about how I seemed distracted lately, how I never wanted to talk about my day anymore. The truth is, I didn't want to talk about my day, because the best parts of my day involved Shane, and I couldn't exactly share those details with my husband. So I'd give Landon these generic responses about client meetings and paperwork, and he'd get that tight expression on his face that meant he knew I was holding something back, but was too proud to push for details. Shane made me feel like the woman I used to be before I got married. Confident, desirable, exciting. With Landon, I felt like I was playing a role, going through the motions of being the perfect wife. With Shane, I felt like myself again. He'd tell me I was brilliant, that my insights about his business were invaluable, that he looked forward to our meetings all week. When was the last time Landon had said anything like that to me? The physical chemistry with Shane was incredible too. After years of scheduled, routine intimacy with Landon, being with Shane felt like rediscovering my own sexuality. He was passionate, spontaneous, attentive, in ways that Landon hadn't been in years. I started dreading going home to my predictable, passionless marriage after spending time with someone who made me feel so alive. I know what you're thinking. I was a terrible wife, a cheater, a liar. And yeah, maybe I was all of those things. But you have to understand what it's like to feel invisible in your own marriage. To feel like you're just going through the motions with someone who's more interested in maintaining the status quo than actually connecting with you. Shane saw me, really saw me, in a way Landon hadn't in years. The meetings became more frequent, more intimate. Shane would book these long lunch appointments, and we'd spend half the time actually talking about business, and the other half just being together. He'd tell me about his dreams, his ambitions, his frustrations with his job. I'd share things about myself that I hadn't talked about with anyone in years. It felt like we were building something real, something meaningful. I started looking forward to these meetings more than anything else in my life. I'd wake up on days when I was supposed to see Shane with this excitement that I hadn't felt about anything in my marriage for years. I'd spend extra time getting ready, choosing outfits that I knew he'd appreciate, perfecting my makeup and hair. It felt good to put effort into my appearance for someone who actually noticed and appreciated it. The guilt was there, of course. Every time I lied to Landon about where I was going or what I was doing, I felt this little stab of conscience. But it was easy to push that guilt aside when I thought about how disconnected we'd become, how he seemed more interested in his routines and his expectations than in me as a person. I told myself that if he'd been paying attention, if he'd been meeting my emotional needs, I never would have looked elsewhere in the first place. Shane started talking about the future, about how unhappy I seemed in my marriage, about whether I'd ever considered that maybe Landon and I weren't right for each other anymore. These conversations should have been red flags, but instead, they felt validating. Here was someone who could see what I was going through, who understood that I was suffocating in a relationship that had stopped growing years ago. I never intended for it to go on as long as it did. I kept telling myself it was just a phase, that eventually I'd end things with Shane and figure out how to reconnect with Landon. But months went by, and instead of ending the affair, I found myself getting deeper and deeper involved. Shane became the highlight of my week, the person I most looked forward to seeing, the one who made me feel most like myself. That's when everything started to unravel. I should have known that someone would eventually notice the pattern, the frequent meetings, the long lunches, the way I'd light up when Shane's name came up in conversation. I should have been more careful, more discreet. But when you're caught up in something that intense, that consuming, you start to think you're invincible. The phone call came on a Tuesday afternoon. Landon was at work, and I was getting ready for another client meeting with Shane when the phone rang. The voice on the other end was nervous, hesitant, clearly uncomfortable with what she was about to tell me. "Is this Landon's wife?" she asked. "I need to speak with him about something important, but I need to make sure you're not around when I do." My stomach dropped. I knew immediately that this had something to do with Shane, with our affair, with the secret life I'd been living for months, but I played dumb, asked what this was about, tried to sound casual and unconcerned. "I work at the bank," she said. "I'm Shane's secretary, and I think your husband needs to know what's been going on in my boss's office." That's when I knew it was over. Arya had figured it out, had been watching us, had decided to blow up my entire life with one phone call. I tried to talk her out of it, tried to convince her that she was misunderstanding the situation, but she'd already made up her mind. She was going to call Landon and tell him everything. I hung up the phone and just sat there for a minute, trying to process what was about to happen. My marriage, my comfortable life, my reputation. It was all about to come crashing down because some nosy secretary couldn't mind her own business. I thought about calling Shane, warning him that we'd been found out. But what was the point? The damage was already done. When Landon came home that evening, I could tell immediately that he'd gotten the call. He had this cold, controlled expression that I'd never seen before. He didn't yell, didn't scream, didn't throw things. He just looked at me with these calculating eyes and said, "We need to talk." "I know about Shane," he said, his voice eerily calm. "I know about the meetings, the lunches, all of it. Someone from his office called me today and told me everything." I could have denied it. I could have played innocent, claimed it was all a misunderstanding. But something about the way he was looking at me, like he already knew every detail, made me realize there was no point in lying anymore. "How long?" he asked. "A few months," I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. "Why did you take your ring off in his office?" The question hit me like a punch to the gut. How could he possibly know about that detail? But there was no point in denying it now. He didn't like me wearing it when we were together, I said, unable to meet his eyes. Landon just nodded, like he'd expected that answer. "Pack some things," he said. "You're staying at your sister's tonight. We'll figure out what happens next tomorrow." I wanted to argue, to explain, to make him understand that this wasn't just some meaningless fling. But the look in his eyes told me that nothing I said was going to matter. He'd already made up his mind about what this meant, about what I'd done to our marriage. That night, lying in my sister's guest room, I kept thinking about Shane, about whether he knew what was happening, about what this would mean for both of us. I destroyed my marriage for this man, and I wasn't even sure if he felt the same way about me that I felt about him. The next morning, Landon called and asked me to come home. He said he wanted to try to work things out, that he was willing to forgive me if I was willing to do whatever it took to rebuild our marriage. I was so relieved, so grateful that he was giving me another chance. "There's just one thing I need you to do," he said. "I need you to send an email to Shane's company, telling them about the affair. I need to know that you're willing to end this completely, publicly, permanently." I was horrified. The idea of exposing Shane, of potentially ruining his career, of humiliating myself in front of his entire company, it seemed extreme, cruel even. But Landon was adamant. He said it was the only way he could trust me again, the only way he could be sure I was serious about ending things with Shane. I spent hours trying to talk him out of it, trying to find some other way to prove my commitment to our marriage, but he wouldn't budge. It was the email or divorce papers. Those were my only options. So, I wrote the email. I detailed the affair, the meetings in Shane's office, the lunches, everything. Landon stood over me while I typed, making sure I didn't leave anything out, adding details that made the whole thing sound even more sordid than it had felt at the time. When I hit send, I felt like I was signing Shane's professional death warrant. But I told myself it was worth it if it meant saving my marriage, if it meant Landon and I could move past this and start over. The next few days were tense, but hopeful. Landon seemed to be making an effort to reconnect with me, to rebuild the intimacy we'd lost. I was so focused on proving that I was committed to our marriage that I didn't really think about what the email would mean for Shane until he called me, screaming. "What the hell did you do?" he yelled into the phone. "They suspended me pending an investigation. My career is over because of that email you sent." I tried to explain that I hadn't had a choice, that it was the only way to save my marriage, but he was furious. He said he was going to make sure I lost my job too, that if his career was over, mine should be as well. And he did exactly that. Within a week, my company had received a formal complaint about my conduct with a client. The investigation was swift and brutal. I was fired almost immediately, my reputation in the industry destroyed, my career effectively over. I was devastated, but Landon comforted me, told me we'd get through this together, that our marriage was stronger now because we'd survived this crisis. I believed him. I wanted to believe him. For a few weeks, things actually seemed to be getting better between us. We talked more, spent more time together, even started making plans for the future again. I thought we'd actually managed to rebuild something from the wreckage of my affair. That's when Landon dropped the bomb. He sat me down one evening, looked me straight in the eye, and said, "I want a divorce." I was stunned. "But I thought we were working things out," I said. "I thought you'd forgiven me." "I never forgave you," he said, his voice cold and matter-of-fact. "I just wanted to make sure you faced the same consequences Shane did. I wanted to watch you lose everything the way you made me lose everything." The realization hit me like a freight train. He'd never intended to save our marriage. The whole reconciliation had been an act, a way to manipulate me into destroying Shane's career and my own. He'd played me perfectly, and I'd fallen for it completely. "You tricked me," I said, my voice shaking with rage and disbelief. "You cheated on me," he replied. "For months. You lied to my face every single day. You took off your wedding ring to sleep with another man in his office. Did you really think there wouldn't be consequences? He handed me divorce papers that he'd apparently had drawn up weeks ago, while I was still believing that we were working on our marriage. Every detail had been planned, every move calculated to maximize the damage to both Shane and me. Shane was right about one thing, Landon said as I stared at the papers. You did feel trapped in this marriage. You weren't ready for the commitment, for the responsibility of being a real partner. You were bored with me, looking for an escape. Well, now you have one. The divorce was finalized within a few months. I got the apartment, but good luck to me trying to afford the rent without a job. Landon got to walk away clean, while I was left with nothing. No husband, no career, no reputation, no future prospects. Shane lost his job permanently and has been struggling to find work ever since. His reputation in the industry is shot, just like mine. He's been sending angry messages to Landon, blaming him for ruining both our lives, but Landon just forwarded the threats to his lawyer and got a restraining order. It's been almost a year now, and I'm still trying to pick up the pieces of my life. I'm working retail, living paycheck to paycheck, watching my savings disappear, while I try to figure out how to rebuild a career in an industry where everyone knows what I did. The worst part is running into people who know the whole story. They look at me with this mixture of pity and judgment, like I'm some cautionary tale about what happens when you throw away a good marriage for a meaningless affair. But they don't understand what it was like to feel invisible in my own relationship, to feel like I was dying a slow death of routine and indifference. Shane and I tried to maintain some kind of relationship after everything fell apart, but it's hard to build something real on the foundation of mutual destruction. We're both too bitter, too angry, too focused on what we've lost to create anything new together. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I'd just ended things with Shane before they went too far. If I'd tried harder to fix my marriage instead of looking for excitement elsewhere. But then I remember how suffocated I felt with Landon, how invisible, how taken for granted. Maybe this was always going to be the outcome, one way or another. Look, I know I made mistakes. I know I hurt people, destroyed relationships, ruined careers, but I also know that I was dying inside that marriage, slowly suffocating under the weight of Landon's expectations and routines. I needed something more, something real, something that made me feel alive again. The fact that Landon could plan such an elaborate revenge, could manipulate me so completely while pretending to forgive me, just proves that I was right to look elsewhere. What kind of person does that to someone they supposedly loved for 8 years? What kind of man destroys his wife's entire life just to prove a point? I'm not saying I'm innocent in all this, but I'm also not the only one who made choices that hurt people. Landon chose revenge over reconciliation, manipulation over honesty, destruction over healing. Shane chose to pursue a married woman, knowing full well what the consequences could be. We all made our choices, and we're all living with the results. The difference is that Landon gets to walk away from this mess, with his reputation intact, his career unaffected, his future bright and full of possibilities. Meanwhile, Shane and I are left to rebuild our lives from nothing, branded as the villains in a story that's a lot more complicated than anyone wants to admit. But I'm not giving up. I'm not going to let this define me forever. I made some bad choices, but I'm not a bad person. I just wanted to feel alive again, to feel desired and appreciated and valued. Is that really such a terrible thing to want?